Hello, my name is Jakayla and my co-hosts are Abraham, Zach, and Jonah. Today we're diving into the story of the Vietnam War. We'd like to welcome you to Poof Poof. In this episode, we will uncover how the world became dangerously close to nuclear war and what we can learn from it today.
Although the struggle in Southeast Asia had a start in the French imperial era in the 1800s, most historians agree that the Vietnam War began in the 1950s. Over time, the long conflict would involve the US, France, China, the Soviet Union, Cambodia, Laos, and other nations. It ended in 1975 when North and South Vietnam were unified as a single nation. The complicated political and military considerations surrounding a conflict that would ultimately claim millions of lives are explained in the timeline of the Vietnam War that follows. Have you heard of the Geneva Accords?
Well, the accords limit the actions of foreign military forces in Southeast Asia and establish two regroupment zones in Vietnam, roughly along the 7th parallel divided by a demilitarized zone. This is the same idea that was and still is being used to split North and South Korea at the 38th parallel. Communist forces must leave the DMZ to the north, while the French and Southern forces must leave to the south. In order to create a single national leadership, the deals also state that the North and the South must hold general elections within 2 years. The implementation of this agreement is overseen by an international control commission made up of Canada, Poland, and India.
However, the violence of South Vietnam's Diem government quickly led to a communist rebellion amongst the people of the South. The rebellion became known as the Viet Cong, the Buddhist Christ, which lasted May to November 1963, was a time of political and religious unrest in South Vietnam that was marked by a campaign of nonviolence led mostly by Buddhist monks and a number of punitive actions by the government. The shootings in 9 armed people were demonstrating against a ban of Buddhist flag in central city of Hue on May 8 served as a trigger for a conflict. The army was Republic of Vietnam staged a coup in November 1963, and on November 2, 1963, President Ngo Diem was arrested and killed, bringing an end to the crisis.
Sikhodak, a Buddhist monk, publicly burned himself to death to ask President Ngo Diem to treat all religions with charity and compassion. Despite ongoing Buddhist demonstration and repeated appeals from the United States to ease his government laws, Diem, a Catholic who had been persecuting the Buddhist majority, remained strong. In the weeks that followed, more Buddhist monks set themselves on fire. The president's sister-in-law, Madame No, called the burnings barbecues and offered to provide matches. Diem and his brothers were killed in a coup by South Vietnamese military soldiers in November 1963.
Over 30 U.S. Air Force aircraft hit sites along the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos on March 3, 1965. This was only one of many American air and ground attacks on roads and villages along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a military supply route known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail, connected North Vietnam and South Vietnam by Laos and Cambodia. During the Vietnam War, the route transported supplies including ammunition, weapons, and labor from communist-led North Vietnam to their allies in South Vietnam.
A somewhat smaller group of Viet Cong rebels defeat South Vietnamese troops at Ap Bac, a village in the Mekong Delta, southwest in Vietnam. Despite their 4-1 advantage in preparation and technical support of American advisors, the South Vietnamese are defeated.
The Gulf of Tonkin incident was a series of naval attacks on U.S. destroyers in the Gulf of Tonkin in 1964. The attacks led to the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which increased U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. President Lyndon B. Johnson declares that he has directed the current 75,000 American soldiers in Vietnam to be increased to 125,000. Johnson added that if more raises were needed, he would issue them. He stated that the monthly draft calls would be increased from 17 to 35,000 in order to meet the growing need for military personnel. Johnson also called on the United Nations and any of its member states to support the United States' efforts to find a diplomatic conclusion to the war.
The Battle of La Drang Valley, the war's first major engagement, resulted in about 300 American deaths and hundreds more injuries. In what would become a usual approach, American ground forces are dropped onto and removed from the battlefield by helicopter during the conflict in the central highlands of South Vietnam. Each side declares victory.
March 16, 1968, over 500 civilians were killed by American forces during the My Lai massacre. The slaughter takes place in the midst of a U.S. search and destroy mission which aims to locate enemy areas, destroy them, and then withdraw. President Johnson stopped bombing in Vietnam north of 20th parallel in March 1968. In response to criticism of the war, Johnson declares he will not seek re-election.
1969 to May 1970, U.S. B-52 bombers target suspected communist base camps and supply zones in Cambodia as part of a covert bombing campaign known as Operation Menu. Although the operation would be made publicly by the New York Times on May 9, 1969. Nixon and the government chose to keep the bombing secret because Cambodia is officially neutral in the conflict.
President Richard Nixon waited 2 days after ordering U.S. ground forces to invade Cambodia on April 28, 1970, before declaring the start of the invasion on the national television. The
Pakistan started authorizing secret airstrikes of alleged communist supply roads and base camps in Cambodia in March 1969 as part of Operation Menu. On May 9, 1969, the New York Times made the operation public, sparking outrage, and around the world, the United States started covertly bombing Laos in 1964 and would go on to bomb it more intensively per capita than any other country in the world. So Cambodia wasn't the first neutral nation to be targeted by the U.S. during the Vietnam War. The Ohio National Guard shot at unarmed students at Kent State University on May 4, 1970 because they believed the students were a threat. The shootings occurred during a protest against the Vietnam War.
The Ohio National Guard killed 4 unarmed college students and injured 9 others on Kent State campus during the Kent State shootings. The shootings occurred on May 4, 1970 during the demonstration against the draft and the National Guard's presence on campus, as well as against the United States military growing engagement in the Vietnam War and Cambodia. Over the course of 13 seconds, 28 National Guard members shot roughly 67 rounds, killing 4 kids and injuring 9 more, including 1 more becoming permanently paralyzed.
A top-secret Department of Defense investigation on American public military engagement in Vietnam between 1945 and 1967 was known as the Pentagon Papers. As the Vietnam War continued with over 500,000 American soldiers in the country by 1968, military analyst Daniel Ellsberg, who had contributed to study, became anti-war and believed that the American public have the access to the Pentagon paper contents. The depth and duration of U.S. engagement in the Vietnam before the Gulf of Tonkin event, including participation in a 1963 coup in South Vietnam, and the United States bombing of Cambodia and Laos, which was not covered by the mainstream media at that time, are among of the more shocking disclosures in the papers. The New York Times published a slew.
The Vietnam War came to an end when the North Vietnamese army captured Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, on April 30, 1975. U.S. soldiers evacuated thousands of South Vietnamese and Americans in the preceding days. On the front lines, American diplomats were planning the largest extensive helicopter evacuation in history.
So the Vietnam War was a long, expensive, and polarizing battle that fought South Vietnam and its main ally, the United States, against the communist government of North Vietnam. The ongoing Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union worsened the issue. This helps us understand history and prevent things like this from happening. We'd like to thank you for joining us on Poof Poof. Don't forget to tune in next time to dive in more into the past.